The scene opens in near silence, broken only by the faint chirping of insects and the rustling of leaves. A woman, visibly pregnant and drenched in sweat and blood, crawls through the thick undergrowth of a shadowy jungle. Her face is pale, streaked with tears and dirt. Each movement sends a jolt of pain through her body, but she refuses to stop. Her trembling hands leave behind faint smears of blood on the mossy ground as her torn clothes cling to her bruised skin. She gasps for breath, her lips cracked, as she fights to stay conscious. Something in her eyes, fear, desperation, and an ember of hope, pushes her forward, inch by painful inch. A gold chain with a broken pendant glints around her neck, barely visible beneath the blood. In the distance, thunder rumbles, as if the jungle itself is bearing witness to her torment. The voiceover cuts in, low and haunting. She trusted her new family, until they betrayed her in the cruelest way. A series of quick, jarring cuts flash across the screen, blood droplets on a stone, a discarded rope, the sound of a door slamming, and the fading echo of a woman's scream. Then, the contrast, a sleek black luxury car pulls to a stop at the edge of a muddy trail. The door opens and a man in a crisp white shirt steps out, his face drawn, alert, and haunted. He scans the ground, his eyes locking on the faint trail of blood disappearing into the dense jungle. He kneels, touches the blood, and clenches his jaw. Something in his past flickers in his mind, something painful. The camera zooms in on his face as the voiceover returns. What made a millionaire follow a trail of blood through the jungle? The jungle looms in front of him like a living nightmare. But he doesn't flinch. He takes one step forward, and disappears into the green abyss, chasing a trail that might save a life or uncover a horrifying truth. She was born into a world already touched by tragedy. Her parents died in a car accident when she was just a baby, leaving her in the care of her maternal grandmother, a quiet and resilient woman who lived in a modest home at the edge of a sleepy town. The house was small, the furniture old, and money was always tight, but it was filled with warmth, discipline, and love. Her grandmother did everything she could to raise her with values, teaching her how to be kind even when the world was cruel, how to work hard, and how to carry herself with dignity no matter her circumstances. She grew up watching others live lives of comfort and security, often gazing longingly at families laughing in cafes, couples holding hands at markets, children riding in expensive cars. But instead of growing bitter, she used her solitude to dream. She dreamed of love that didn't hurt, of a family that didn't abandon, of a home where she could finally exhale without fear. She wasn't naive, just hopeful. And in her heart, she believed that love could rewrite her story. Then one day, as if fate had chosen her moment, he walked into her life. He was tall, handsome, and impeccably dressed, with eyes that seemed to see through her walls and a smile that warmed the chill of her reality. He claimed to be in town on business, but their chance meeting in a bookshop turned into a series of conversations, then coffee, then dinners. He listened when she spoke. He made her laugh in ways she hadn't in years. He told her she was different, pure, untouched by the materialism he said suffocated his world. When he revealed he came from a wealthy, traditional family in the city, she hesitated. The gap between their worlds felt too wide. But he reassured her, again and again, that he didn't care about class or money. He wanted a woman with a good heart, and he had found her. Her grandmother, frail and weary from years of watching the world break gentle hearts, warned her to be careful. She reminded her that some people wear masks until the wedding rings are slipped on. Friends whispered doubts too, urging her not to rush. But she was already swept away, caught in the tide of attention, affection, and promises. Within a few short months, he proposed in front of a small fountain in the park where they had their first date. The ring sparkled like a dream, and despite the nervous weight in her stomach, she said yes. Her grandmother's face fell when she shared the news, but still, she hugged her and prayed it would all turn out well. They married quickly in a simple but elegant ceremony arranged by his family, who seemed warm on the surface but distant beneath their smiles. She moved into his grand house in the city, unaware that she had just walked into a place where love would become a weapon, and trust would be her most dangerous mistake. In the early days of her marriage, everything felt like a dream finally realized. The mansion she now lived in gleamed with chandeliers, marble floors, and luxury beyond her imagination. Her in-laws greeted her with polite smiles and customary gifts, speaking gently and welcoming her into their home with what seemed like genuine affection. She tried her best to blend in, to respect their traditions, to earn their approval. She would wake early, help with the chores even when it wasn't expected, and speak with humility, always careful not to offend. But it wasn't long before the warmth began to cool, revealing cracks in the golden illusion she had fallen into. The smiles became thinner, the words more measured. Her mother-in-law would glance at her clothes and say, "You're not quite city-ready yet, but you'll learn." Her father-in-law rarely acknowledged her unless it was to correct her manners. They never yelled, at first. The abuse was a quiet, creeping fog that slowly choked her spirit. Meals were a battlefield of silent messages. She would cook for the family, and they'd eat without compliment, sometimes even ignoring her dishes altogether. On days when she didn't feel well, they would leave her out entirely, serving food to everyone else while she sat quietly at the corner of the table, pretending not to feel the sting. Her husband, once so attentive, started to pull away. He came home late, spoke little, and never defended her. At first, she thought it was just adjustment, everyone needed time to grow into new roles. But then came the whispers behind closed doors, the instructions she wasn't meant to hear, and the sharp glares from her mother-in-law whenever she offered her opinion. It became clear that they hadn't welcomed her, they had tolerated her. And that tolerance was wearing thin. When she found out she was pregnant, she held the test in her trembling hands with a mix of fear and joy. She thought maybe, just maybe, this new life would change everything. She imagined the family rejoicing, her mother-in-law crying with joy, her husband lifting her off her feet in celebration. But reality was far crueler. When she shared the news, her husband's face remained blank. Her mother-in-law's eyes narrowed. Her father-in-law muttered something under his breath and walked away. There was no happiness, no congratulations. Just silence, and then, cold anger. "We're not ready for this," her husband said flatly. "You should have asked us first." From that moment, the hostility became blatant. They began excluding her from family conversations. Her movements were monitored. She was discouraged from visiting her grandmother. Her meals were smaller, her requests ignored, and every symptom of her pregnancy treated like a burden. Her husband, once her source of strength, now echoed his parents' opinions without hesitation. "You're too emotional," he said when she cried. "They're just being practical." The girl who once dreamed of love now lay awake in a silent room, hands resting on her growing belly, wondering how the home she prayed for had become a prison of soft-spoken cruelty. As the months passed and her pregnancy progressed, the tension inside the house turned suffocating. She could feel it in the silence that lingered after she entered a room, in the side eyes exchanged between her in-laws, and in the forced politeness that barely concealed disdain. Her mother-in-law had grown especially bitter, constantly muttering about how the child would bring shame or divide property. Her father-in-law suggested it was too soon for a baby, that it would ruin their reputation. Even her husband, who once swore to protect her from the world, now treated her as nothing more than an inconvenience. He stopped talking to her beyond simple commands, and the way he looked at her belly changed, no longer with awe, but with resentment. One evening, as she sat in her room folding baby clothes she had bought with her own savings, her mother-in-law knocked gently and entered with a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. She spoke sweetly, suggesting that the whole family should take a short religious pilgrimage to a remote shrine, to pray for peace in the family, she said. Her father-in-law nodded in agreement, adding that a spiritual trip might cleanse the negativity surrounding them. Even her husband urged her to go, claiming the fresh air would do her and the baby good. It felt strange, almost too kind, but in her fragile state, desperate for even a sliver of unity, she agreed. The journey began at dawn. They packed light. She noticed her grandmother was not informed, and when she asked about calling her, her mother-in-law quickly dismissed the idea. "It's only for a day," she said. "No need to worry anyone." They drove for hours into unfamiliar terrain, the city disappearing behind thick trees and winding paths. She started feeling drowsy, her vision blurring. Her lips tingled and her heartbeat slowed. She turned to ask what was happening, but her words slurred into incoherence. Her head fell against the window as darkness pulled her under. What she didn't know was that her mother-in-law had slipped something into her juice during breakfast. When she woke, she was lying on the cold, damp ground of a dense forest, wrists loosely bound with fabric torn from her own dupatta. Her legs were heavy, and her head spun with nausea. The jungle loomed around her, thick and terrifying. Birds screeched above, and the distant howling of wild animals sent chills down her spine. As she tried to sit up, she saw her in-laws standing just a few feet away. Her father-in-law leaned on a stick, looking down at her like she was something rotten. Her mother-in-law didn't even flinch as she said, "This is what you chose, not us." Her husband stood behind them, silent, expression unreadable. She looked at him, pleading silently, tears streaming down her cheeks, whispering, "Please, don't let them do this." For a fleeting second, something flickered in his eyes, guilt, fear, or maybe doubt. But he said nothing. He turned his back as his mother tossed her a bottle of water and said, "Try surviving. If you make it out, maybe you deserve to live." With that, they walked away, the sound of their footsteps fading into the jungle shadows. She was left lying in the dirt, trembling, helpless, her unborn child kicking faintly inside her. The pain of betrayal cut deeper than the vines scratching her skin. She had loved these people, served them, prayed for their acceptance. And now they had condemned her and her child to die alone, unseen, unheard, forgotten. She slowly opened her eyes to a dim, filtered light seeping through the thick canopy above. Her head throbbed painfully, and every breath felt shallow and uneven. Her wrists were bound tightly with coarse fabric that bit into her skin, the knots unforgiving and unfamiliar. Around her, the jungle pulsed with a life she had never known, the hum of insects, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional distant howl of wild creatures. Panic surged through her veins as she realized the full weight of her situation. Alone, helpless, and injured in the depths of a forest far from civilization, her heart pounded against her ribs like a desperate drumbeat. She tried to move, but a sharp jolt of pain shot through her abdomen, forcing her to wince and lie still. Tears welled up in her eyes, tears born of fear, confusion, and a raw, aching loneliness that threatened to swallow her whole. Not long after, voices broke through the jungle's eerie calm. She recognized them immediately, the cruel tones of her in-laws, cold and merciless. Her mother-in-law sneered as she stepped closer, her words dripping with venom, "Let the animals raise your baby. Maybe they'll be kinder than we ever were." The father-in-law chuckled darkly, adding, "You'll be forgotten out here, just another lost soul in the wilderness." Their laughter echoed in her ears, cruel and unrelenting, as they turned and walked away, leaving her tied, vulnerable, and abandoned. She screamed after them, her voice hoarse and desperate, begging for mercy, for help, for anything. "Please, don't leave me here. I'm carrying a child." But the only response was the growing distance between them and the haunting silence of the jungle. Her sobs broke into quiet whimpers as she realized the reality: no one was coming back. The cold fear settled deep inside her chest like a stone. Hours passed, the sun shifting slowly above, casting fragmented light across the tangled undergrowth. Her hands ached fiercely where the ropes cut into her wrists, and her body, already weak from the drugs they had given her, struggled to stay upright. But the instinct to survive stirred something fierce inside her. With trembling hands, she began working at the knots, rubbing the fabric against a sharp rock nearby. Each movement sent searing pain through her wrists, but she refused to give up. After what felt like an eternity, the ropes finally gave way, slipping off her hands just as exhaustion threatened to claim her once more. Free from her bonds, she dragged herself into a sitting position, wincing as a sharp pain in her side reminded her of her injuries. Her clothes were torn, and dirt caked her skin, but her spirit flickered with a stubborn flame. Despite the dizziness and nausea, she knew she had to keep moving. Every minute spent lying there was a minute closer to death. With great effort, she lowered herself onto all fours, crawling slowly through the dense brush. Branches scraped her arms, thorns tore her legs, and insects bit relentlessly, but she ignored the pain. Her mind was focused solely on the small hope that someone, anyone, might find her. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows that danced eerily across the forest floor, she pushed forward, driven by the faint but insistent flutter of life within her. Each movement was a battle, her body weak, her breath shallow, yet her determination was unbreakable. She whispered promises to her unborn child, swearing to protect and nurture it no matter the cost. The jungle was unforgiving and vast, but she clung to a fragile thread of hope that somewhere beyond the tangled trees, salvation awaited. With every painful crawl, she refused to surrender to the darkness that sought to claim her. Not far from where the pregnant woman struggled through the thick jungle, a man moved with quiet purpose. He was a millionaire, a man accustomed to boardrooms and business deals, but today he was far from the polished city life. Clad in sturdy boots and practical gear, he was conducting a land survey on the outskirts of the dense forest, evaluating the terrain for a possible conservation project. The air was heavy with humidity, and the ground beneath him was uneven and wild, yet he moved with careful precision, marking points on his handheld device and noting the subtle shifts in the landscape. His mind was focused but alert, aware of the unpredictability that the jungle held. As he traced a narrow path between towering trees and thick underbrush, something caught his eye, a faint glisten on a leaf, a drop of deep red blood. He paused, stepping carefully forward to examine it. There it was again, another small drop on a broken twig, then more along the dirt. His heart quickened, and an uneasy feeling settled in his gut. This was no ordinary trail, and he knew instinctively that it signaled danger. The millionaire had seen blood before, not in business or politics, but in places far darker and more personal. He lowered himself to the ground, his sharp eyes scanning for any clues, his mind piecing together the story the blood told. The drops formed a trail winding deeper into the jungle, fading into the shadows of trees and thorny bushes. Without hesitation, he followed, each step heavy with caution. Memories surfaced unbidden, a painful past that he tried to bury beneath layers of success and wealth. Years ago, his sister had been trapped in a brutal marriage, suffering in silence behind closed doors. He had found out too late, and despite his power and resources, he hadn't been able to save her. The guilt had haunted him ever since, driving him to create shelters and foundations to help victims of domestic abuse. But some wounds were too deep to heal fully. As he moved carefully along the trail, the millionaire's breath caught at the thought of another innocent life possibly caught in a nightmare similar to his sister's. The blood wasn't just a sign of injury, it was a cry for help, a story begging to be uncovered. He scanned the undergrowth, the fading light filtering through the leaves casting long shadows. He knew that whoever left this trail was vulnerable, scared, and in desperate need of rescue. Despite the risks of venturing further into unknown territory, he pushed on, driven by a fierce determination that transcended fear or caution. His mind raced through the possibilities. Was it an accident? A criminal act? Or something far worse? Every fiber of his being urged him not to ignore the signs. The forest around him suddenly felt less like a place of natural beauty and more like a maze of secrets waiting to be unraveled. With each drop of blood, his resolve grew stronger. He was not just a businessman today, he was a man on a mission, a man who refused to let another tragedy unfold on his watch. The jungle seemed to close in around him, but he kept moving, following the silent trail that might lead him to a life hanging by the thinnest thread. The millionaire's name was Samir, a man whose polished exterior hid a lifetime of pain and regret. Beneath his sharp suits and commanding presence lay a heart scarred by loss. Years ago, he had been a carefree younger brother to a bright, hopeful sister named Amina. She had been everything he admired, strong-willed, kind, and full of dreams. But when she married a man from a powerful family, everything changed. Behind closed doors, the love turned to violence. Amina suffered in silence, afraid to speak out against a husband who controlled every part of her life. Samir had tried to intervene, but his efforts were thwarted by the family's influence and the walls of secrecy that surrounded domestic abuse. When news finally reached him that she had died under mysterious circumstances, the world he knew shattered. The weight of guilt crushed him. He believed that if only he had acted faster or been stronger, his sister would still be alive. that tragedy transformed Samir. He poured himself into building a business empire, not for wealth or power, but to create a legacy that might prevent others from suffering the same fate. He funded shelters, supported victims, and spoke out quietly against abuse, but the ache in his heart remained. The ghost of his sister's pain haunted him daily, reminding him of the fragility of life and the cruelty people could inflict on those they claimed to love. Despite all his success, he felt powerless in the face of such personal loss. As he followed the blood trail deeper into the jungle, a heavy silence fell over him. The memories surged, raw and unyielding. "Not again," he muttered under his breath, the words almost lost in the thick air around him. His voice was barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of a promise, to himself and to the vulnerable life he hoped to find. He pushed aside the creeping fear and exhaustion, driven by a determination that went beyond reason. This was no longer about business or charity, it was deeply personal. Every step into the dense forest was a step closer to confronting the past he never wanted to face again. The jungle's oppressive silence matched the quiet turmoil inside him. But Samir refused to turn back. He knew that somewhere ahead, a life depended on him, just as his sisters had. This time, he vowed, he would not fail. As Samir pushed through the thick jungle foliage, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filled the heavy air. The sun, now low in the sky, cast long shadows that flickered ominously over the twisted roots and dense underbrush. His eyes, sharp and searching, caught a flicker of movement near a muddy stream that snaked quietly through the forest floor. There, slumped against a fallen log, was a figure barely clinging to consciousness. His heart clenched as he hurried forward, calling out softly, "Hey, are you okay? I'm here to help." Drawing closer, Samir's breath hitched. The woman was fragile beyond belief. Her clothes were torn and stained with dirt and blood, and bruises marred her face and arms like dark, cruel maps of the pain she had endured. Despite her exhaustion, her swollen belly revealed she was pregnant, a child growing inside her amidst all this horror. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, filled with confusion and terror, before slipping back into a faint. He carefully cradled her head in his hands, his fingers trembling as he checked for signs of life. She was alive, barely, but every shallow breath she took seemed a struggle against the odds. His mind raced, desperate for a plan. With great care, he lifted her into his arms, feeling the weight of her broken body and the unborn child she carried. Her skin was cold and clammy, and her weak grip tightened momentarily around his shirt, a silent plea for salvation. Samir's chest tightened with emotion, memories of his sister flooding back like a torrent. How many times had he wished he could have been here to save her from a fate like this? Now, fate had given him a second chance. He moved swiftly but cautiously through the jungle, using every ounce of strength and knowledge to navigate the tangled mess of roots and vines. His camp was not far, a small clearing where he had set up basic shelter and medical supplies for his survey team. As he reached the clearing, he laid her gently on a cot and pulled out the first aid kit. His hands worked quickly but carefully, cleaning wounds and wrapping bruises, his fingers steady despite the turmoil inside. The distant call of nocturnal creatures began to fill the air, but his focus remained unshaken. Knowing the gravity of her condition, Samir immediately contacted the doctor he had arranged to be on call in case of emergencies. The doctor arrived within the hour, his face grave as he examined her injuries and monitored the baby's heartbeat with a portable device. The room was thick with tension, no one dared to speak too loudly, fearing they might shatter the fragile thread of life that held her there. Samir sat quietly at her side, watching every rise and fall of her chest, every flicker of movement beneath the fabric stretched tight over her belly. As hours slipped by, a heavy exhaustion settled over him, but he refused to leave her side. The weight of guilt, hope, and helplessness pressed down until tears slipped silently down his cheeks. He whispered prayers for her survival, for the unborn child she carried, and for justice to be served to those who had done this to her. The woman's fight for life was now his fight, a battle that went beyond wealth or power. In that small, makeshift camp deep in the jungle, a silent promise was made, to protect her at all costs and to ensure that the darkness she had endured would not claim her or her child. Once the woman's condition stabilized, Samir knew his mission was far from over. She needed justice, something that could not be found in the jungle's shadows but in the harsh light of truth and accountability. He began by gathering every piece of information he could about her identity. Using the few belongings she had, along with fragments of her whispered story, he pieced together her name, her background, and the cruel family she had married into. It wasn't long before he uncovered the full extent of the horror she had escaped. Her husband's name was a well-known one in the city, connected to a wealthy, powerful family with deep roots in business and politics. The in-laws wielded influence like a shield, protecting their reputation while hiding their cruelty behind closed doors. Samir's anger burned hotter as he learned of their attempts to silence her permanently. "They tried to erase her," he said through gritted teeth one evening, "but now I'll erase their comfort." That phrase became his silent vow. This wasn't just about rescuing a victim anymore, it was about dismantling a system of privilege that allowed abuse to thrive in secrecy. He knew that going head-to-head with such a family would be dangerous, but he was prepared. With his resources, connections, and unyielding determination, he started building a case. Quietly, he reached out to a trusted lawyer known for fighting difficult and high-profile cases. He shared everything: the blood trail, the rescue, the woman's injuries, and the testimony she was slowly able to give. The lawyer was stunned but resolute. Together, they began gathering evidence, contacting witnesses, and preparing for what would become a public battle. Samir also understood the power of media in shaping public opinion and ensuring the case couldn't be swept under the rug. He discreetly contacted journalists who specialized in social justice stories, offering them access to the facts and emphasizing the need to expose the truth. The media interest grew steadily, turning a private nightmare into a national conversation about domestic abuse, privilege, and justice. Headlines began to appear: "Pregnant woman abandoned to die in jungle, millionaire's rescue sparks outrage, in-laws' dark secrets revealed." The public response was swift and fierce, demanding accountability and protection for the vulnerable. Law enforcement agencies, pressured by the spotlight, reopened investigations and expedited legal actions. Throughout this process, Samir remained a steady presence for the woman, ensuring she had the support she needed to face what lay ahead. The legal battles were just beginning, but with the combined force of justice, media, and public will, the walls of silence and power started to crumble. The woman was no longer alone. A movement had begun, not just for her, but for all those whose voices had been buried beneath wealth and fear. Samir's quiet vow was becoming a powerful reality: to strip away the comfort of those who believed they were above the law, and to bring light to the darkest corners where abuse had long been hidden. Days later, the woman's eyelids fluttered open to the soft glow of morning light filtering through the tent's thin fabric. Her body ached in every corner, each breath shallow and cautious. Confusion clouded her mind as she tried to piece together where she was and what had happened. The dense jungle, the pain, the fear, it all felt like a distant nightmare, yet the bruises and the heaviness in her belly confirmed it was real. She tried to move but found herself weak and tethered to the fragile threads of survival. Panic bubbled up inside her, a silent scream trapped behind trembling lips. When her eyes finally settled on the figure beside her, the man who had carried her through the forest and cared for her, something inside her broke. Relief flooded through her veins, dissolving the thick fog of terror. Tears streamed freely as the reality of safety washed over her for the first time in what felt like an eternity. She sobbed quietly, overwhelmed by the kindness that stood in stark contrast to the cruelty she had endured. Samir reached out gently, his voice calm and soothing as he explained the events she had endured and how he had found her following the blood trail. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a deep compassion that invited her to trust again. Slowly, as the days passed and her strength returned, she began to open up. The walls she had built to protect herself crumbled beneath the weight of her pain and the unwavering kindness of the man who saved her. She told Samir everything: the sharp words that had cut deeper than any wound, the cold silences that echoed louder than screams, the betrayal of the husband who had once promised to protect her. She spoke of the isolation, the denial of food, and the moment they left her alone in the jungle, tethered and bleeding. Each detail was a release, a way to reclaim the power that had been stolen from her. Samir listened intently, never interrupting, absorbing her story with a heavy heart. He knew these words carried the burden of years of suffering, but also the first steps toward healing. In this small, quiet space far from the world that had failed her, a fragile bond formed, one built on trust, respect, and the promise that she would never face darkness alone again. Determined to ensure justice was not just a distant hope but a reality, Samir poured his vast resources into launching a full legal battle against the woman's tormentors. He hired the best lawyers, investigators, and advocates who specialized in cases of domestic abuse and family violence. Every piece of evidence, her testimony, medical reports, the blood trail, and witness statements, was meticulously gathered and prepared to build an unshakable case. Behind the scenes, Samir worked tirelessly, coordinating with legal teams and pushing for swift action. He knew that money and influence often shielded abusers, but he was determined to use his power to break that cycle and hold the in-laws accountable. Word of the case began to spread beyond the courtroom. A carefully managed media campaign was launched to shed light on the horrific ordeal. Major news outlets picked up the story with headlines like "Pregnant Woman Left to Die by In-Laws," "Millionaire's Rescue Uncovers Dark Family Secret," and "Jungle Horror Sparks Nationwide Outrage." The public response was immediate and fierce. People across the country were horrified that such cruelty could occur in the shadows of wealth and privilege. Social media exploded with hashtags demanding justice, calls for legal reform, and support for victims of domestic abuse. Influencers, activists, and everyday citizens united in outrage, turning the woman's story into a powerful symbol of resistance against silence and impunity. The mounting public pressure forced authorities to take swift and decisive action. Police reopened investigations with renewed vigor, conducting raids and interviews that had been stalled or ignored for years. The in-laws, once untouchable behind their status and money, found themselves under intense scrutiny. Arrest warrants were issued, and soon, law enforcement officers arrived at their grand estate to execute the orders. The shockwaves rippled through their social circles, shaking the foundations of their carefully guarded reputation. For the woman, the storm of legal battles and media attention was overwhelming but necessary. Each development brought a sense of hope and validation, a reminder that she was no longer invisible or powerless. With Samir's unwavering support, she prepared to face the courtroom and the world, determined to reclaim her life and protect her child. The justice that had once seemed impossible now felt within reach, an affirmation that even in the darkest places, truth and courage could prevail. Slowly, the days turned into weeks, and the woman began to heal, not just physically but in ways far deeper than bruises and scars could show. The pain that once consumed her started to soften, replaced by a fragile hope and quiet strength. The medical care, the gentle support from Samir, and the safe environment allowed her body to mend, but it was the kindness and respect she received that began to rebuild her shattered spirit. Therapy sessions helped her confront the trauma, while moments of laughter and small joys reminded her that life could still hold beauty. Each sunrise became a symbol of renewal, a chance to reclaim the future that had once been stolen from her. When the time came, she gave birth to a healthy baby girl, a miracle born from darkness. The tiny life brought light into their world, filling the space with soft cries and tender moments that felt like healing balm for her weary soul. Holding her daughter close, she felt a profound mix of love, fear, and fierce determination to protect this new life at all costs. The baby became a living testament to survival and hope, a reason to fight even harder for justice and safety. Samir remained a steady presence throughout, not as a lover but as a guardian and protector. His role was clear: he was there to provide security, support, and guidance, helping her navigate the challenges ahead. Their bond was built on trust and mutual respect, a partnership forged by shared purpose rather than romance. He ensured she had the resources she needed and helped her plan for a future free from fear. Together, they faced each new day with courage, knowing that while the past could never be erased, it no longer defined them. From the ashes of cruelty and betrayal, a new beginning was quietly blossoming, one filled with hope, strength, and the promise of a better tomorrow. As the woman's strength grew and the legal battle gained momentum, Samir uncovered a haunting connection that sent chills through him. While reviewing old records and hospital files during his investigation, he discovered that the very hospital where the woman had once volunteered, before her marriage and tragic ordeal, was the same place where his sister, Amina, had died years ago. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. Their lives, separated by time and tragedy, had crossed paths in ways he never could have imagined. It was a painful reminder that abuse and suffering often hide behind familiar faces and places, leaving scars that echo across generations. Maybe this was destiny, Samir murmured softly one evening as they sat together, the weight of the past mingling with the hope of the future. The thought that fate had brought them together, not by chance, but for a purpose greater than themselves, gave both of them a new sense of meaning and resolve. It was no longer just about survival or justice, it was about transforming pain into power, and loss into legacy. Inspired by this profound connection, Samir decided to take his commitment even further. He announced the creation of a foundation named after the woman, a sanctuary dedicated to supporting abused women and children, offering shelter, legal aid, counseling, and hope. The foundation aimed to break the cycle of silence and violence, shining a light on stories that often went unheard. It became a beacon for those trapped in darkness, a place where healing and empowerment could begin. Through this foundation, Samir and the woman joined forces to honor their shared past and fight for a future where no one would have to endure what they had. Their story became more than a tale of rescue, it became a movement, a promise that even in the deepest shadows, hope could rise, and justice could prevail. Voiceover, she was thrown away by the very people who should have protected her, her own family. Left alone in the darkness of the jungle, her fate seemed sealed. But fate had other plans. A stranger, a man haunted by his own loss and pain, followed the silent trail of her suffering. He saw not just a victim, but a soul worth saving. Sometimes, kindness comes from the most unexpected places, sometimes from those who carry their own scars. This broken man became her guardian, her shield, and her hope. In his compassion, she found the strength to heal, to fight, and to reclaim her life. Together, they proved that even in the face of cruelty, the human spirit can rise. As her story spread, it became a beacon, a call to end the silence that hides abuse behind closed doors and shiny facades. It reminds us all that every life is precious, every voice deserves to be heard, and no one should suffer in silence.